So here we go. All right. So the topic that I'm presenting on today is the impact of secondary traumatic stress, or STS, on educators. We will jump right in. My background. My name is Sarah Fangman. I am the professional school counselor at Hazelwood Elementary. I have been the counselor there for 4 years. I have worked in education in various roles, stemming from being a kindergarten instructional assistant, an ECE teacher, an interventionist, and now as the school counselor for 10 years. So our question today is, why focus on secondary traumatic stress, or STS? My student support team and I are focusing on self-care as part of the 4-phase re-engagement plan for our staff at Hazelwood. And during that planning meeting, we discussed the topic of secondary traumatic stress and how it affects educators. So this began my research and supported our emphasis on the importance of self-care for educators who work with students who have been affected by trauma. Our objectives today are to define secondary traumatic stress, discuss who is at risk, outline the factors that contribute to risk, examine the effects of STS on educators, consider preventative strategies, including personal prevention and coping at work, and discuss interventions when you recognize STS, and self-care. So, what is secondary traumatic stress? Secondary traumatic stress is the emotional duress that results when an individual hears about the firsthand trauma experiences of another. So the essential act of listening to these trauma stories may take an emotional toll that compromises professional functioning and diminishes quality of life. This secondary traumatic stress, the term secondary traumatic stress, is used interchangeably with compassion fatigue. Excuse me. Let me turn off my, I apologize. Alrighty. So who is at risk? There is little research about the effect of secondary traumatic stress on educators. The development of secondary traumatic stress is recognized as a common occupational hazard for professionals working with traumatized children. Any professional who works directly with traumatized children and is in a position to hear the recounting of those traumatic experiences is at risk for secondary traumatic stress. So Hazelwood, for example, is a Title I school. We have about 45% of our population who are English language learners. Included in that population, we have refugees. We have students who, across grade levels and different cultural backgrounds, have experienced a lot of traumatic events. And I know that that is also the case for most teachers or most educators or staff members who work with students in our schools. At Hazelwood last year, we participated in trauma-informed care training, which is also something that I suggest for those of you that have not participated in it. It is exceptional. It really gives you an in-depth look at what we can do as educators to help serve our students who have been exposed to trauma. All educators and staff, coming from our custodial staff, if they work the door whenever kiddos come in to your school in the morning, to cafeteria workers, to the counselor like me, to teachers, to the Family Resource Center coordinator. We all hear about traumatic events from students at one point or another. It might just be something that they pop in and say, hey, this happened to me. So it is not limited to teachers or counselors. It can be anyone who works in a school. It is possible for you as an educator to experience this secondary traumatic stress if you're hearing about these repeated events that a kiddo has experienced, or if you have several, like for a classroom teacher, you have 20 to 30 students in your classroom. So you could be hearing events from multiple children. And so, it is definitely something that if it is repeated, that we are at risk for. So that is why I found it so interesting and very important for us to learn more about this topic. So the factors that contribute to risk, there are three factors that I have learned about. Your student population. So if your school or your place of work has students who are in special education, and we all know that every school has students that are in special education, you have a higher risk of being exposed and having the secondary traumatic stress. Students living in high poverty, students with parents with drug or alcohol dependency, LGBTQ youth, immigrants, or if you have students who have lived through a crisis, a hurricane, terrorist attack, suicide of a peer, or etc. Your personal characteristics could contribute to your risk. So your awareness of secondary traumatic stress symptoms and causes, our natural and acquired ability to deal with stress is also a factor that can contribute to your risk. The degree to which we empathize with students' circumstances. And I know as a school counselor, it is just in my nature that I am an empathetic person. And so I feel what my students are feeling. And I know that teachers and other staff that work with students are also in that same boat. And then another personal characteristic is your own personal history of trauma. The last factor that contributes to the risk is your school environment. So if your school encourages teachers to attend to self-care, provide support to engage in self-care, acknowledges challenges of teaching trauma-exposed youth, and that is where that trauma-informed care comes in and why it is that training, why that is so important. And if your school environment fosters open communication, those are all factors that can contribute to your risk of secondary traumatic stress. So the effects of secondary traumatic stress on educators. So like I mentioned earlier, there is very little research on the effects of secondary traumatic stress on educators. This is why I kind of delved deeper into this topic and why I will continue my research on this topic just to find out more and how we can help other educators and other people that work in a school. So the effects of STS on educators, you might have intrusive thoughts or re-experiencing of the event, like nightmares or flashbacks, so that empathizing, feeling what our students have gone through. Feeling on edge and waiting for something bad to happen, like you can't concentrate, you're more irritable or angry. You could experience avoidance of memories, feelings, or people associated with your students' traumatic events. And then you could also have negative changes in how you think or feel. So again, going back into that difficulty concentrating or feeling confused, guilty, or sad about what happened to the student, a more negative viewpoint of yourself or the world, the guilty, hopeless, angry, or cynical feelings, problems sleeping, feeling disconnected from others, and a diminished sensitivity to violence. What I have heard from others is if you are repeatedly told or you're exposed to students who have experienced this trauma, or you have issues or incidences that occur within your building, sometimes we feel desensitized to how significant or severe those events are. Chronic exhaustion, loss of creativity or irritability, social isolation, poor self-care, and avoidance of listening to students because you are afraid of what they might share. So if you've experienced an interaction with a student where they have disclosed something that's extremely traumatic, you might avoid listening to that student or other students again because you're afraid that they are going to share something similar to that. And then arousal and hypervigilance. So I looked into, these are terms that we hear a lot, but I wanted, for my own personal knowledge, I hear arousal and hypervigilance a lot. However, I wanted to look at what the definition of that was. And it's increased alertness and sensitivity to your environment. So you have an over alert awareness of what things are happening around you, and the dangers of things that are happening around you. And most of the time, based on this definition, the dangers are not real. So you're really being impacted by that traumatic event that you were told about. So prevention strategies, self-monitoring is something that's very important, but it is imperative with secondary traumatic stress that we use self-monitoring. So we're looking for, if we're feeling very irritable, if you're feeling like you are isolating yourself, if you're very cynical, if you avoid work activities, if you feel fatigued, or if you are detaching. So a main question is, how do we know when we are being affected by this work in ways that are harming us? So when we are triggered by trauma cues, we are at high risk for overreacting to a situation that we may not have had an extreme reaction to before, experiencing strong feelings as intolerable. So we are having extreme feelings and they're something that we cannot deal with at that moment in time. Numbing or shutting down, or feeling hopeless and overwhelmed. Often we do not have the opportunity to process what we are experiencing. So a prevention strategy for secondary traumatic stress is to find a buddy, a supervisor, a colleague, a therapist to talk and reflect with, or to take some alone time to reflect on the feelings that you are having. Personal prevention and coping at work. So according to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, which is one of the references that I really dug deep into, personal prevention would be to maintain adequate self-care. And I know that this is something that we harp on a lot. It's suggested that we practice self-care. But I am guilty. I'm a person who, I know that we all need to practice self-care, but it's hard sometimes, and it's hard to make time in your schedule to do those things. But it's even more important now that I know about this secondary traumatic stress, and especially because we're in this virtual world that is different for us and is causing a lot more stress on us in this role. So, personal prevention, maintaining adequate self-care, is to know and honor your own personal limitations. Exercise compassion for yourself. In our role as educators, we exercise extreme compassion for everyone, for others, for other teachers, for students, for the people around us. But we need to exercise that same compassion for ourselves. And then learn how to say no. This is something that's really difficult, I know, personally. But it's very important to know your limitations and to know whenever you cannot do anymore. The next one is to maintain appropriate boundaries with students. Stay emotionally connected without becoming overly involved. So it is very important that our students know that we care about them, that we're connected to their stories, but without becoming overly involved. And I realize that is it's a very thin line. One moment. However, we have to realize and recognize whose needs am I meeting. We have to think about ourselves. So, the last one is to leave work at work. Again, that is something that during our virtual learning world, it is very difficult because we are working from home. So maintaining that balance and drawing the line between work and home. Another prevention strategy is coping at work, taking breaks, seeking support from others, and learning relaxation techniques to incorporate into your routine. I have stars at the bottom. This is very important. Proper rest, nutrition, exercise, and stress reduction activities are also very important in preventing secondary traumatic stress. So just taking care of yourself. So if you recognize that you are experiencing secondary traumatic stress, some interventions that you can put into place, like I mentioned earlier, maintaining an appropriate work and life balance. Leaving work at work, and just making sure that you are dedicating a set amount of time to work activities, and then whenever work is finished, that you do other things. So activities that rejuvenate you and heal you. Attending to spiritual needs, if that is something that you believe in. Discuss your experiences with a supervisor or colleague. So recognizing that other people are feeling these the same way, and using that as like a sounding board, to talk with other people about how they're experiencing these feelings, and they might have suggestions as well. Obviously seek therapy if needed, and then this is something also that I think is very important, but taking a mental health and wellness day. This is something a lot of us just leave our personal days in the bank. But it is important that we take those mental health and wellness days. Just take a day for yourself if you are feeling and recognizing that you have these secondary traumatic stress symptoms. There is a website, Support for Teachers Affected by Trauma. The acronym is STAT. They have a website. There is a free training. It is amazing. It is 5 modules. It does take some time, but there are 5 modules that are free, and it goes in depth into the effects of secondary traumatic stress on educators. So it gives you the opportunity to take a self-assessment questionnaire if you recognize those feelings of secondary traumatic stress. In my presentation, I have a link. The underlined word link will take you to the website, Support for Teachers Affected by Trauma, the STAT website, and it will take you straight to that training page. I do highly suggest that you take the time to go to this website. It's very valuable information. So the last part of this presentation is self-care, and I didn't want to focus the whole presentation on self-care, although it is very important, but the information that I've provided to you on secondary traumatic stress and how it affects educators just really drives home the importance of self-care. So this was new to me. I've heard the term self-care, but I have never seen it broken down as into these 3 basic concepts. So awareness, balance, and connection. So the first step is to seek awareness. So this requires us to slow down, focus inwardly, and determine how we are feeling, what our stress level is, what kinds of thoughts are going through our heads, and if those thoughts and actions are consistent with who we want to be. So more than likely, if you are someone who is experiencing these effects of secondary traumatic stress, or you have had a stressful day and you have heard the recounting of a traumatic event from a student or a family, that awareness piece is going to be very important, because more than likely you are in a state at that point in time that you do not want to be in. So the second step is to seek balance. So we're seeking balance in all areas of our lives, including work, personal, family life, rest, and leisure. We know that we will be more productive people if we've had that opportunity to rest and relax. But this also goes into becoming more aware of when you are losing that balance in your life, and giving us that opportunity to change. And then the final step is connection, and that involves building connections and supportive relationships with coworkers, students, friends, family, and community. So one of the most powerful stress reducers is that social connection. So this reflects back upon, how your school environment will affect your risk factors in experiencing secondary traumatic stress. So if you have a work or a school environment that promotes, having conversations, taking time to reflect, having a buddy system or someone that you can go to if you just need a break, that will help with that connection piece and will reduce your risk of experiencing secondary traumatic stress. And then other self-care ideas: spending time with children and adolescents who are not experiencing traumatic stress will help us to regain that perspective. So a lot of times we are inundated, especially as a school counselor. I know, especially as classroom teachers, we are inundated with children and adolescents who are experiencing traumatic events. And so in order to regain that perspective, have a conversation with a kiddo who has not, or have a group of students who the focus is on positive, more exciting events that are happening, and have that conversation. Engage in fun activities, find time to self-reflect, allow yourself to cry and feel those emotions, and then find things to laugh about. So, I appreciate your time. If you all have any questions, I can open the floor for that. My email address is also listed here, and I feel free to please reach out to me. I would love to have conversations or bounce ideas off of each other, or if you have questions that I cannot answer, I will also ask if you would email me so that I can get back to you about those questions and find an answer for you.